Well, thanks for joining us for today's webinar on how many prospects should be assigned to a major gift officer. This topic came about because we've had a lot of discussion amongst our clients as to whether, an appropriate size pool for a major giver team is 45 or 120 or 200, and how do you determine what it should be? So we've gone back and looked at a lot of data, and we've created some frameworks which we're going to run through today. So just as intro, this is Doug Cogswell. I'm the President and CEO of Advisor Solutions. Got a bunch of experience in business intelligence, and we're working with a couple hundred, 200-300 fundraising clients, higher education, healthcare, and also not-for-profit. The actual metrics for sizing a pool is pretty consistent across higher education, healthcare, and not-for-profit fundraising. We've also do a whole bunch of data analytics, which is part of our work in fundraising. So as we sort of define what we're talking about, if you look at a pyramid, at the top there's principal gifts, which for the sake here we're going to say are $5 million plus donations from a prospect. And when we talk about donations, we're talking about giving in like a year's period. So if the thing gets split into multiple gifts, if the total is $5 million or more, that's general principal giving. And that's a different process. It's much more hands-on, far fewer prospects, longer close cycles, all of that. So we're not talking about that today. We're talking about the thing in the middle, major giving, where we're generally talking about $50,000 to $5 million donations. And again, that's per prospect within a year, not individual gifts. And then underneath that, there's high-end annual, which has more velocity, smaller gift size. Pool sizes are going to be very different there. So if you categorize this, basically principal giving is elephant hunting. I mean, you get one of these every couple years. If you get a $20 million gift, that's pretty awesome. Like a couple of them at $5 million, that's really good. So it's just a different velocity. Major giving is more farming. I mean, we're using terms here from consultative sales and industry. This would be typical farming, where there's a pool of prospects, and you're trying to work them over time to move them from an unqualified state into a closed state where they make a commitment. And high-end annual is much more of a marketing effort, where much more velocity, combining more email and phone and some in person, and so it's a different mix of things going on down there. So we're talking about this middle one, major giving. And we're going to just talk off a funnel. So if you look at this, there's a general pool of prospects up here. And in our work, we generally want to make sure that the highest capacity and most attached or engaged prospects are assigned. And there's a bunch of metrics you can work through to get that. Let's assume that work's been done and we have a pool of, say, a couple thousand prospects we're going to sign out to a bunch of field officers. And I will caveat that often when we look at assigned prospect pools, there are prospects that probably shouldn't be in that pool, and there's others that aren't in it that should be, and analytics can help you untangle that on both ends of the spectrum. Then they come into the pool, they need to be qualified. Are they actual prospects or not? Are they capable of being closed in the relative near term or not? Then they get cultivated, and this is generally a year or two process. So you want to be qualifying people into these cultivation stages, and some people will break this into two parts, near cultivation and longer cultivation, or other words like that. Then they get solicited, and then they come out the bottom. And if you look at it from the bottom, which is where we're going to start, across our clients, we typically see a typical field officer is capable of closing 8 to 10 prospects in a 12-month period. So we like to work with, we call it L1 to last 12 months. It's a moving 12-month window. And it's sort of about capacity. If you look at industry, you get similar metrics. Now, obviously, if we look at a pool of field officers, some will close more, some will close less. So this is sort of median performance. And we see this across quite a range of our clients. And then in terms of dollar value, if we look at the major giving efforts on median, we're seeing $100,000 to $125,000 donation per prospect in this 12-month period. It's median because one, is $6 million, $4 million, we're in the major giving area, donation is going to skew the mean up over that. And obviously there's going to be some field offices who are underperforming under this, but a typical median would be in this $100,000 to $125,000 range. So that means the field officer is generating $800,000 to $1.3 million per year. We see that fairly consistently in a pool that's been up and running for a while. This is not a new pool. We'll look at that in a minute. It's a pool that's been around. We're seeing these kinds of revenue generation is fairly typical. If you back this up, we're seeing typical close rates of 20 to 30%. That means solicitations that are made, 20 to 30% close. There's obviously field officers who are better than that, and in our metrics work, you want to highlight them and figure out how they're doing better than that, because that's a really good thing. And there's going to be some that are lower, so there's clearly a range. But if you work that to get 8 to 10 prospects closed per field officer in a 12-month period, you need to have 25 to 35 in solicitation. And the solicitation phases, they've obviously been cultivated, so they're engaged, they've been met with, and there's an ask on the table that you're now trying to get closed. And there's a variety of reasons why some of the asks close and others don't, but we see yields like this. So then back it up another level. So it takes, say, a year to run somebody through solicitation, 6 months, 9 months, typical times. You want to have in cultivation the next 2 years worth. So there's a, at the end of the year, the top or the bottom end of this cultivation drops into solicitation. These guys are closed in or out. And then the second year out moves into the near year. Then some people come in from cultivation. So a healthy pool generally has about 2 years worth of solicitation capability in cultivation. And that's where you're trying to figure out, if the issue is they're not attached or engaged as much as other prospects, and volunteer committee participation really matters, or coming to reunions is highly influential on becoming attached and making a large gift, then it's over this period where the team is working to fill those attachment or engagement gaps. And in the case, get the person on the key volunteer committee, make sure their friends invite them to the reunion and they come. And when they come to the reunion, they have a positive time. That's all the cultivation stuff. Obviously, in cultivation, you can't do much with capacity unless maybe they have a private business and you have an M&A for as part of your team or related. I mean, you can help them sell the business, but there's limited things you can do to capacity. But there's a lot of things you can do on attachment or engagement to get the, we call it the expected value, which is the combination of the capacity and the attachment up to a higher level, so they're more likely to close. I'll also add, as I said that, kind of the metrics we use, you're trying to figure out expected value for asks. If you take the capacity, and most of the numeric scoring tools will create a factored range of capacity or engagement from 0 to 1 or 0 to 100 if it's percent. So if you have $1 million capacity and the person is very disconnected, multiply the million by 2% and you get a $20,000 expected ask. That would be a good ask for the field officer, and it should be able to get closed at these kinds of rates. If that same $1 million prospect who is in cultivation is highly engaged, and that might be a 0.3 or a 0.4 factor, so you're looking at a $300,000 to $400,000 gift. So those attachment/engagement factors matter a lot in terms of probability of closing, but also in determining the amount of the expected ask, and they'll come together. And that's in cultivation. What you're trying to do is really work the attachment engagement factor to a higher level. So if you have 50 to 70 in cultivation, you generally want 25 to 30 in qualification, because you want those to become the next year's cultivation. And this is the most volatile group. So, this is generally you want to qualify in or out in 6 months. So the 25 at the end of the year may be a very different group than the beginning of the year, because you're trying to get them in and out as efficiently as possible. So if you look at this, the pool size for this field officer, just add these things up, is 100 to 125. And again, there's motion in this, so there's things in and out. It's not the same pool, June 30th as it is September 30th as December 31st. You're going to see more motion up here. These things may go out and more come in from here, and then these are going to go in and out over the year. This is the most volatile. Presumably these are more stable. But across the board, we're seeing, typical yields in performance would say that a proper pool for an up and running major giving team, it should be 100 to 125 prospects per field officer. Now let's look at another case. Suppose it's a new program, like you're just getting going. could be a state school that's never really run a major giving program before. It's been kind of ad hoc. It could be a not-for-profit that's kind of had 3 people doing it. Now you're setting up a program. It's different, and it's different because at the bottom you get different close rates. I mean, you could have the same group of people, but on average you're less known. There's not a pattern of giving. You haven't had all the attachment and engagement things to build up attachment and engagement, so the expected value of the ask and the reality of what you're closing comes in lower. So when we did some analysis across our customer base, the newer programs, the close levels were more $40,000 to $70,000 per prospect per 12-month period, donations, all gifts totaled for the prospect. But we see higher close rates as well. As the dollar value goes down, we're actually getting more velocity, 15 to 25 for a median field officer in the last 12 months close for one of these new programs. And you expect that. I mean, it's harder to close the bigger gifts. They take longer, all of that. And we're seeing the close rates here actually have quite a bit of range, 20 to 40%, though there seems to be a little bit higher upside in some of our clients in these newer programs. And these, by the way, this is more like a high-end annual fund program. The numbers would be a little bit lower on the numbers, a little bit higher in the velocity, but this is sort of a hybrid between a high-end annual and a more general up-and-running major giving program. So if you have these 20 to 40% yields on the solicitation closes, you want to back up, you want a couple years in here, that's 80 to 100. You've got to have about a year's worth of qualification up in here. So that puts the pool size up at more like 150 to 250. And, we've seen that, and that's normal. And so if you're a new program and people are saying 100 and 125 per pool, well, if you actually did that and you cut this back, I mean, your revenue is going to drop by a half. I mean, at this level, you're getting $700,000 to $1.2 million yield per field officer, which is good. It covers, it's a good ratio. If you drop that in half, you're getting pretty tight on the cost of actually having a field officer, and in industry would be called the gross margin. The margin on the field officer's cost is actually pretty slim. So you actually pretty much do need to get these kinds of yields, to really support and justify and then expand the program to cover new prospects. So that's one of the things. The points of confusion are, people say one thing and it doesn't apply to everybody. There's some very different metrics and ratios out there. Then on the other side, we looked at some of the more mature programs in our portfolio. They're getting higher median donations, 140 to 170. And the median may actually be higher because in this case you may have more, even up into the sort of 5, 10 million range might come in, and there's going to be more 3 and 4 million. So the median is even more skewed. But the median is 140 to 170. Getting about the same numbers closed per year as the general program, but the revenue per field officer is 1.2 to 1.7, so that's a pretty good margin and a richer program. If you back this up, you've got 15 to 25 in solicitation because the yields are higher. We'll show you some examples in a minute, but if you're running 40 to 50% close rates, you can have fewer in solicitation, work them harder. Remember, you're driving to bigger numbers, so it does take a little more work. Puts the cultivation at 30 to 40. And we've had some of our clients who would talk about an assigned pool of 45 to 55, which is this part of the pool. And so what happened to qualification? Well, there's 2 ways we've seen some of our clients handle qualification. We've been talking about assigning them, which is the general way. Prospect research gives you 30 accounts to qualify. Another way is don't assign them. Let the field officers mine through the prospect pool. It's an identified pool, screened pool, but they can pick the ones they want to qualify, and they're not assigned until there's been a visit. They move into qualification. If you look at that, that effectively means although they're not assigned, they're working another 15 to 20 in qualification. They have to be, or they're not going to fill the cultivation bucket, and there'd be some metrics on the unassigned qualification prospects. So in reality, if you compare them the same way, the mature program pool generally is going to be 60 to 70. So higher returns, better yields, the program is more mature, there's more engaged and attached prospects. The whole culture of giving is just more established, so this thing just has a higher push out the bottom. So I think I'm going to continue on revenue and some other what you do with this, but I think one of the reasons we've heard such a divergence is somebody will say, you ought to have 120 to 125 prospects assigned to each NGO. And somebody else will talk about, hey, we cut our pools down to 45 to 55. And somebody else will say, well, we got 200 in ours, and what's the right answer? Well, there are clearly at least 3 different models in this thing, and off on the left is the high-end annual, and off on the right is the principal giving. The principal giving would be even tighter than this, and the high-end annual would be a little bit looser than this. So I thought it was really important to get a framework like this out there. And then here's just some actual data from our clients. I just picked 5 of them. I'm not going to say who they are for obvious reasons. We looked at a lot more than this. We have several hundred clients we mined through. So if you look at private college number 1, their median accepted amount, again, it's prospect-based, last 12 months, is $150,000. Their median acceptance rate was 8 to 10 closed prospects per year at a yield of 45%. That's pretty much the right side, the mature level we just talked about. Private college number 2, the median accepted $115,000. They got the same 8 to 10 accepted at a 22% median yield. That's that middle, the regular kind of typical program. Public number 1, public number 2, you can actually see these are, all 3 of these are newer programs. You don't have the same established practice of giving. The major giving whole processes and programs are newer. And there's been not the same established focus on building attachment and engagement through a series of things aimed at creating it over time. And so the cultivation is harder. I mean, some schools don't have mature reunion programs, which are awesome for building attachment or engagement, but if they're not there, you have less to work with. The same with committee participation of alums. So that's what's happening down here. You're getting, it's harder to get the higher asks because you might have the same capacity, but you do not have the same attachment or engagement levels. They're getting, numbers accepted. This is pretty awesome, 15 to 25 median. Great yield. So, they got this thing working really well. It's hard, to pick that up, though. It's going to take some time to push that up to where the privates are. Publics 2 and 3 got progressively lower median accepted amounts per prospect. You're getting a reasonable action rate here on closes. The yield here, though, this one's low. So that would be an issue with the program. Why are they below the typical? I don't know, but that would be, you want to look at that and figure out why aren't they getting the same yield as their cohorts. And here's one that's really awesome. I mean, a great yield, but boy, that looks a little low. I'd probably look at this and say maybe you actually should be pushing the asks up a little bit because this is coming in really high. You might be leaving money on the table. But I did want to just go into some of the actual data here that we had worked through to put this framework together. And so we're comfortable that, these are general and there's ranges in all of this, but they're representative. So the next question is, what does this mean for revenue? So if I look at this middle general pool, and let's say we have 2,000 prospects in our pool, that would take, if you're signing at 110 prospects per NGO, that would be 18 major gift officers, fairly typical. And you would get a total revenue at these levels of 18 to 25 million. Now, if you take like, a median here of 1 million times 18, you get the 18. But again, this is median and not mean. There's going to be some larger gifts that are going to skew the mean up. So, $1 $2 million gift is going to kind of add to the upside. So that's why we put the range of 18 to 25 million per year. And again, we're talking about moving 12-month windows, so they're normalized years. Go to the left, same 2,000 prospects. You got more prospects for field officers, so you can actually get by with less field officers. And your revenue, though, is going to be lower because the average take per field officer is lower, and you're probably less likely to get the high upside. But the return on field officer in that model is pretty good and works. You go to the right, the same 2,000 prospects at a ratio of 60 to 70 per MGO. It means 30 field officers more to get the coverage, but boy, there's a lot more revenue in here because the median is higher, and then you're going to have probably more upside gifts, which pushes the upside potential higher. So these are actually quite illustrative of 3 different levels of programs and the kinds of yields we're seeing. In our work, we're obviously trying to put the data in so you can measure and manage this, but we're also trying to provide strategic guidance And as I actually went through this thing with the examples in the prior pages, some things I just highlight and flag out. And there often are trade-offs between ask levels and yield rates. And there's, oftentimes you see people under asking, and there's ways of putting metrics on that and really help to maximize revenue in these kinds of ranges. So, talked a bit about how to size the pools. We did a webinar last fall on key metrics in major giving, which I'm just going to summarize here in the next 5 or 6 minutes because I think this really is critical once you get the pools to actually maximize them. So when we look at these pools and then trying to figure out how to manage the team to be most effective, there's 5 things that jump out all the time. First is prospect assignment. Are all of our highest capacity and most engaged prospects staffed, which is what I talked about at the beginning. We often see there's staffed prospects that aren't as good as some of the unstaffed prospects, and especially in qualification, you'd much rather have the high capacity, highly engaged than other things in there. You might actually want a lower capacity who's more engaged than a higher capacity who's disconnected because that person needs to be brought along further before they're going to have a real chance of coming through that pipeline. Then penetration. Is our pool of assigned prospects being connected with? Often we see people measuring teams on visits, which is one measure, but more important than visits is if I have 100 prospects, am I connecting with 90% of them in a year? Am I having some kind of visit, meaningful contact solicitation with at least half of them in a year? You're going to have trouble moving through those cultivation levels, solicitation, close, if that's not happening. And we see cases where if there's a visits target, people are hitting the visits target, 75, 100, or whatever in-person visits in a year, but they're doing it with a handful of people a lot, like their friends. They're having 10 lunches, 15 lunches with 3 people. That gives you a pretty good start on your visit connection, but they may only be penetrating or connecting with 40 or 50% of their pool, which means they're leaving over half unconnected with. So this penetration is a different way of looking at the activities and pretty important. A third level is movement. Are we moving the prospects down those stages at a reasonable pace? You want to really look at outliers. It means qualification, it should be a 6-month typical in and out. If you see things in qualification, 12 and 18 months, that's a problem. You got to ask some questions, what's going on? And cultivation, they ought to be the attachment and engagement, which you could put a number on, should go up the longer they're in cultivation. So if somebody's been in cultivation 18 months and they have the same attachment score after 18 months that they had when they went in, that ought to raise some questions like what's going on here? How come you've been on them for 18 months and they've never been to a reunion, or they've been to no events? What's going on? They haven't made a gift? Like, what kind of cultivation is going on? So tracking that and then having those discussions can really help move through that pipeline in a way so it's efficient. And solicitation levels. I was at a conference earlier in the week and I asked a question of a group there with only 30 around the table. And I said, do any of you look at measuring the actual asks and comparing them to capacity to attachment to see if they're at the right level? And no one, not one person in that room was. In industry, this is like one of the most important things. What is the price we're getting? Here ought to be, what is the ask we're getting? Because if someone has $1 million prospect who's highly engaged and should be getting $300,000 and they're getting $30,000, they're leaving $270 on the table. Now that might give them a high yield because they're going to close really quick if they're way under asking. These two really go together, but we're really encouraging people to look at the ask amounts and compare them with the expected value from the capacity and the attachment. It's easy to do, and the capacity might be off. The attachment could probably be debated, but it drives a discussion, and it should flag the cases where you're asking $30,000 and you should be asking $300,000 and you're leaving $270 on the table. So we are big on that and think that should be one of the strategic measures. And then yield, we looked at that in the charts before. And one of them we saw 45% yield in one of those state schools, but they had lower typical close level than their peers. That would be a question. Is the high yield because we're under asking? And if you had a lower yield but had higher ask, would you make more money? Would that be better? So those are the kinds of things we look at, and we flag that. Too often we see the focus on visits this fiscal year to date. This came up at the conference earlier in the week. And the problem with this is it's not strategic, and you can fudge it by just having a lot of visits with a few people, and it also drives the discussion around the table about the last visit. I had a great dinner with Mark on Tuesday, and let me tell you about my meeting with Mary over the weekend. Instead of, hey, I actually think we're getting hung up a little bit in qualification, and boy, the ones that have been in cultivation a while, I'm not seeing the attachment scores move. How can we help you enhance that? And there are obviously a variety of ways that could be enhanced. Because for a field officer to be fully effective, they've got to have the right prospects. They've got to connect with most of them, which is the penetration, move them through stages, figure out how to get them more attached, ask them at the right level, and get them closed. That's what the game's all about. It's not about visits and activities. It's about doing that. We actually had an example of a field officer who on the visits metric, he would have fired. He had like low visits compared to his peers. But he had high penetration because he was really savvy about leveraging the dean and the provost and everybody else to work with his prospects. He was asking at a really aggressive level and closing. He was making more revenue than his peers, even though his visit levels were really low compared to his peers. So at the beginning, you'd think you'd fire the guy, but then his yield and success was really strong. He ought to be showcased as an example for the rest of the team of how to get high asks closed at a high rate, which is what the game's all about. These things, when you do this, those metrics, they should be used to uncover stories, and I just shared several of them in my dialogue or my monologue there. And the goal is to find best practices and coaching tips. Like that example of the guy who got high asks and high yields, like have him talk about how he did it and uncover the success factors. Somebody who moves somebody up from detached to highly engaged in cultivation over a 12-month period, what do they do? How did they get them to a reunion? Did they get them to the reunion? Did they get them on a committee? What happened, and how did the team help them? Those shared stories discussed openly with the team are what causes improvement. Where we see the discussion go wrong is when the metrics become good or bad thresholds. You missed this thing that's bad. It may or may not be bad. The guy who missed the visit number was actually great because he was nailing it everywhere else, and he had a better way of doing it. So you got to watch the good, bad stuff. Review, set plans, focus on strategies and strategic metrics, group discussions, and generally, and you want to do this, quarterly. You want to have a team in and discuss pool strategy and set plans and adjust and get feedback on cultivation and close rates and solicitation and all of that. And we often get, if it's not in the system, it didn't happen. Often there's weak data. Well, people aren't putting the stuff in the system on proposal stages or prospect stages, and you actually start talking about it, and they're always last on the team. That's not going to sustain. They'll start putting it in because it's important. Nobody wants to be last on the team. And it's never perfect, which is why it's not necessarily good or bad threshold. It should drive a discussion, and maybe the issue is the data is bad. Fine, fix the data. But this can drive continual improvement both with the data and with the team. So kind of this whole area, the main thrust here was to what's the right size pool, but that goes directly with then how do you manage the pool once you've assigned it. And a lot of this stuff in here comes from consultative sales and industries, whether it's a professional services firm like a law firm or a consulting firm or a technology-enabled solutions company. They're doing exactly this, and they have metrics, and they're moving through stages, and they're measuring time in stages, and they're trying to figure out how to get the clients engaged and cultivated. So there's no magic here. It just seems that in fundraising, it's been more of an art than a science, and we're trying to bring some of the science along with the art, not to kill the art, but just to blend them together so that teams become more effective. And when we see some of the debate that goes on around pool sizes, it draws us in to say, we've got a lot of data. Let's put some data on the table and see what it says. There is on follow-up. You've got my name and phone number. Be glad to talk. Also up on our website, there's a resources page with webinars. The major giving webinar, and there's a whole set of webinars up there on how to use analytics with a team, and this one will be up there within the week. So we have a kind of whole free resource pool going forward on these topics. That completes the planned or the presentation, and We got a wide range of questions. So a couple came in ahead of time, which I'll read. What about donors and stewardship? What percentage of an NGO's portfolio can realistically be taken up with donors in stewardship stage, particularly after a long campaign? Yeah, so my numbers in this presentation do not include stewardship. This is, people you're trying to, or prospects, you're trying to qualify, increase their attachment and engagement through 1 to 2 years of cultivation, ask them an appropriate amount and close in or out. So it's a dynamic pool. Stewardship is, out the bottom, back into the prospect pool, maybe some delay, they can become active again. So usually we would recommend, that's a different skill set. If you have the resources, put stewardship people on them. If you don't, increase the pool sizes a little bit and let the NGOs work with the key prospects in stewardship. If it's a fundraising team, the goal ought to be they actually come back into that active pipeline some point in the future, and the goal of stewardship is to, keep them warm so that can happen. Maybe I'm using too many sales terms here, but that's the general idea. What do you do with individuals who aren't really gift prospects, such as relatives of the prospect donor, that the field officer is engaging in a relationship as part of the overall giving strategy, but who aren't the gift prospect? So I know many of you tag people, individuals, as the prospect. The better way, and many of the systems allow you to do this, is the prospect is a group that can be multiple people. Could be the husband-wife relative. There's varying ways of defining the prospect. In this, I've used the term prospect as that holistic thing. So if the field officer is working the prospect, and it's the husband-wife, the contact with either one of them ought to be measured against that prospect, and that's important. And in my case, it'd be hard to get a large donation out of me if my wife wasn't involved. It would not happen. So you need both of us. And most of these systems can handle that and then aggregate the activities in for the 2, 3 parties in the prospect. I know we've got some clients that have that model of multiple entity prospects. And then that prospect, which is the family unit or whatever you call it, can actually be a program prospect at one or more schools. So perhaps, I'm a prospect at the business school, and my wife went to the law school, so she's a prospect at the law school. Well, as a family unit, we're one family unit and a program prospect at 2 schools that may have separate managers on it, and then somebody overseeing the whole thing. In that case, you'd want to manage the program prospects through this kind of a process because they're separate giving things, but you've got to obviously coordinate it. So there's a whole bunch of sub-detail on that, but that's the general concept. And we prefer, if it's possible, to have this concept of the prospect being the family unit, whatever the unit is that's the giving entity, and then they could actually be a program prospect at more than one place. If you take the model back to commercial, consultative selling and industry, that's what it is. I mean, an opportunity would be, say, the marketing department at an auto manufacturer. Well, within the opportunity, there's multiple stakeholders. There's the advocate, who's the person who's interested in the thing you're selling. There's typically a technical endorser who has to provide some validation, and maybe a budget holder who's a third person or party. There may be other influences. So part of consultative selling is identifying the set of stakeholders and managing the whole thing over the line, because you could have the advocate all excited, but if the budget holder isn't on board and the technical gatekeeper negates it, you're not going to get the sale. So it's the same concept here, and you want to manage the prospect of the whole opportunity. Are there rule of thumb engagement factor multipliers for likelihood and amount? Good question. So I think this is going to expected value. If we're doing that work, we'll take the capacity, which could be research generated, it could be wealth engine target, whatever, it could come off wealthy zip codes, but you can monetize the capacity. Like if it's $1 million to $4 million range or something, set it a third of the way up, it'd be like $1.5 million or whatever dollar value. Then the attachment or engagement scores, most of the modeling tools will put them in a range, and our tool forces it to do a 0 to 1 range. So be 0, it would be a 0.02, a 0.11, 0.21, all the way up to 0.95 or something. But those scores are highly skewed towards the left. Like there's a whole bunch of them that down at the left, and then there's this tail of outliers that go up. And if it's done right, and you need to do some tests, but you could multiply that score times the capacity and get an expected amount. And we've done a bunch of tests on that. That works pretty well, which is, so if you have $1 million capacity and your attachment score is 0.5, the expected ask amount would be $500,000. If the attachment factor is 0.02, it would be $20,000. And you also got to look at what they've already given, because usually those capacities are all in. So if they, the expected value is $500,000, and they just gave $300,000 in the last year, the expected ask is probably $200,000. So we have a whole paper on that. If you want more detail, let's take that offline. But we have a whole paper on how to use attachment and capacity to create expected values for an ask, and also for looking at a pool of prospects. What about coming out of a major campaign, 150 million? What about coming out of a major campaign? How many prospects? Well, you can back it. Maybe the question is, if you have a 150 million campaign, how many prospects do you need? We actually did a webinar on that in January. It's up on the website. You can see at the bottom here. It was about campaign feasibility and tracking. And we did it with one of our partners, Marianne Pelletier. And we looked at monetizing pools of people for a campaign, and how do you determine if you have the right prospect pool to hit the numbers. So that'd be a good way to get at that. It's a longer topic than we probably want to hit in the Q&A here. Do you count the prospects in closure towards the number tally in portfolios? Yeah, so that's back to the solicitation pipeline. Let me back up to one. Where is it? This. Yeah, so the 8 to 10, this solicitation are the people in process. So, some of them are going to be an ask. This sometimes will get subdivided into a pending close. So they're in here until they close. I mean, at some point they're accepted, then they fall out into stewardship or wherever else they go. But yeah, they're in here through them actually making the acceptance. And as I said, and we kind of broke this into 3 levels: qualify, cultivate, solicit. It's easy to sub-split these. Although I'll add to that we generally don't like to see over 5 stages because it gets confusing. We had a client that had 15 stages when we came in, and it was like debates over whether the prospect should be in stage 7 or 8. It's just too much. On the other hand, we also had a client that had 2 stages, open and closed, and that's probably not enough to measure time through stages and whatever else you might want to do. So like 5 stages is good, and we would normally in practice want to split cultivate and maybe solicit into verbal commit or ask made and verbal commit or pending close or whatever. There's some sub-detail on that. Are all of these stats based on higher education clients? What if the organization was a hospital or social services organization? Are there differences in terms of the numbers? These pool sizes, this page, pool sizes, are pretty standard across, because this is it's like a human capacity to sell. And they're similar to what we see in industry. Like if you went to a professional services organization, you see something like this as well. And when we've done the work in healthcare and higher ed, where most of our work at this level has been, they're consistent. Where it varies is the attachment factors. So the how you engage somebody and what happens in healthcare is different in that you don't have a pool of people that stay with you for like 50 years. It's more of an in or out pool. There's a hospital experience. If they're not engaged reasonably rapidly, they don't stay with you. They move on. Like whereas a university, they keep coming back, and they're in your ecosystem, and they did spend 4 years there. So the other thing on healthcare is, and we're doing a webinar on this later in May. It hasn't been scheduled yet, but there are more and more institutions who are getting access to the patient encounters data in fundraising. And we've done some really cool work there where you can bin that into patient potential, and it's based on which department they were in, the intensity of the stay, which provider they saw, There's some other, how far away they live, there's a bunch of other more demographic stuff. But there's some clear differences when we look at data on whether the hospital's experience creates a strong likelihood of giving or a lower likelihood of giving. And there's even some of the work we've done, some of the traditional areas that you would think would be highly aligned towards giving aren't as much, and some of them that you may not have thought of, like one that jumps is dermatology. Like, it doesn't usually get mentioned, but it's an area that you think about as higher net worth people. They're coming in and having generally a positive experience, so they end up more connected, more likely to give a gift than some of the other areas. So that's in healthcare. You've got the patient data, which is very different than higher ed. The analogy in higher ed, you have the student data, although it ages because at some point it's eclipsed by all the alumni stuff. But these metrics are foot across. Next question. Is all this based on the assumption that the prospect pool is comprised of new prospects being qualified, or is it taking into consideration donors who have been solicited in the past, gone through stewardship, and put back into cultivation? It's both. So this prospect pool up here, we talked a little bit about this a few minutes ago, is a combination of new turfed up prospects, but also stewardship people coming back because somebody came out the bottom and made a gift, $1 million, 10 years ago, has another life event, they come back into the pool, and they do need to be requalified because have their views changed? I mean, all other things. I mean, do they actually have the event? Do they have the money? And then the cultivation may be quicker. I mean, you know more about them. They obviously were highly engaged, attached at one point. That changes in time. But yeah, there's a process that may be a little quicker through the pipeline, but we've included that whole concept in what goes into the prospect pool up here. Next question. If you have a new program with one field officer, is it even worth creating a major gift program? Yeah, so that's no, I mean, at that point, I would do something to find the best prospects. It could even be rough and tumble. I mean, grab major wealthy zip code data, look and see who's been to a reunion or whatever it is, and just pick a list of 150 people and go. By the way, those of you who, like if it's a smaller program like that, you can go through a wealth screening effort, or there's a bunch of wealth information by zip code, both property values and income levels. And if you emailed, put my name up again at the back, if you emailed us, we'd be glad to get you that information. It's public domain. And we actually find that can be at least a great starting point. And if I had a new program with an NGO, I'd do that. I'd just screen out people who live in wealthy towns. I'd look at a few things about reunion attendants who made a gift at all, and go. If my gift officer asks for $1 million, but the prospect says, I'll give you $100,000, do you consider that solicitation to be accepted? I would then, that's obviously good news, you're getting a $100,000 gift. If I'm the manager, I'd want to have a conversation and push back and say, is there something else we could do to make this more enticing? I mean, we actually do think this guy could give $1 million because what's the holdback? And we had this at one of our clients where there was a $1 million gift. I think the capacity was like $20 million. The person was like an owner, completely engaged. And I believe they'd already given like $7 or $8 million. So that ought to be a great discussion. I mean, is $1 million all you can get, or this guy's like totally capable, already made a big gift? Can we give some naming convention or give the person something that fits their interests that they would really get behind? And that's part of the dialogue and what the the field office should be searching out and seeking. But the data and the tools should drive the discussion and flag that, hey, this looks low, let's have a discussion, versus, hey, this is awesome, my $100,000, or that other example of $1 million, it might not be awesome, and you might be able to get, the whole amount, and that would be the discussion. It might be you can't, but that's why it's stories and discussion. There's a lot of questions. Is this webinar recorded? It was recorded, and it'll be up within the week. That was an easy one, I like it. What might be an appropriate ramp-up time for a relatively new field officer? A year. I mean, it's the same thing in sales. So we're hiring some salespeople. I'll tell you what our plan is. We hope to have the new salespeople on in July, and I have no revenue forecasted for them until the winter, and I have then half of what I expect them to get in a quarter in the winter, and it builds to 3 quarters in the June quarter. I have them fully on board for their quota the following summer because, I don't know who they are. I obviously think I know who they are, but we don't really know until they get here, and they have to learn the solution, meet the clients, and work through it. So I think anything over that's probably aggressive. And these numbers are assuming the field officers, those yields have been in for a year. So obviously somebody's just joined, you've got to moderate the metrics. In your work with this type of data, what has been the most counterintuitive insight you've discovered? That's a great question, the most counterintuitive insight. And it flags that similar to the high yield with the low solicitation relative to expected value. I think at the beginning we saw, just the visits. I mean, we saw people who were hitting their visits numbers, and we go, this is awesome. And we saw they would make 15 visits with the same person. Like, there was one there where I think they had 45 visits with 3 people, and they did like 80 visits in a year. It was like, wow. It was funny, but it wasn't so funny. They were abusing the system. I'll think about that one some more. The slides will be available, with the webinar when it's posted up on our website and let you all know. How can you encourage gift officers to look at everyone in their portfolio instead of the same people? Hold on, I'm going to jump out. That's a great question. So I'm actually going to bring up, probably shouldn't be doing this on the fly, but I'll bring up one of our demos because there's a chart in here about penetration. Hold on. Local demos. They tell me never to do this, but I can't hold back. So this is a major giving metrics project, and so we're loading data that would have been preloaded the night before. We're dumping it into RAM on a server somewhere, and it's going to bring up a dashboard with a bunch of pages, one of which is penetration. So this is going to load up. It's got a front page with like a dashboard. We're not even going to talk about this. There's another webinar on this, and there's some descriptive text. If I go to this penetration page, this is how we look at this. And I'm going to do, starting up, bringing up, what is all this stuff? I'm going to, I've binned penetration into, they have a proposal and have been visited in the last 12 months, blue. That's small. They have a proposal, active solicitation, but haven't been visited in the last 12 months, light blue. They've been visited in the last 12 months, but don't have an active solicitation, green. They've been contacted in some way, and they have no proposal and no contact at all in the last 12 months. And then if I let me just select these. This chart on the right is called a spine plot, and it's got my field officers. So for example, Michael Leahy, this is bar. His width is determined by how many assignments he has. The brush up says he's got 102, so he's right in band. You can see some of them, like Gretchen Mayer, have an awful lot. She's really wide band, 233. Probably cut that back. But Michael has blue, light blue, green, orange. With it says at the bottom 80% of his pool. So he's contacted 80% of his pool in some way, and you can see it's mostly visits, the green and the blue. That's great. I mean, he's doing a great job. Where I want to have some conversations down here with like Justina Mercado, who's only reached 60%, and poor Albert down here, he's actually done okay with visits, but he's done no email or phone contacts, and he's only reached 51% of his pool. These should be up at 80 to 90%. And this is going to drive a discussion, because if I'm the manager, I'm going to say, hey Albert, what's going on here? Like, what's up with the 50% you haven't reached? And if you look at the visits thing, he's going to talk about the ones he did visit, these guys, but I'm kind of really interested in what happened to the ones he didn't visit. So this is a tool that in practice is really helpful for tagging who they are. And I could click and get the list really quick of who these people actually are, and we could then run through them. But that's how, using data in visual ways like this so the team can have a discussion about it. And overall, I mean, this is my portfolio, this gray stuff is not being covered at all. I mean, I'm literally assigning prospects, and in a 12-month period, nobody's having any contact with them. That's a big problem because this is not going to go anywhere. Poor Janet down here is like, got 136. She's only been able to connect. Well, maybe she's new, so we'll give her a break. Fine, she just joined, say, 6 months ago. But like, there's a whole bunch of other stories in here. Another question. Do your other tutorials include info on creating and tracking attachment scores? This is a big problem for my organization. We're actually about to do one, and we have one that we're going to get posted. Let me drop out of this. Let me go back here. I'm going to do this quickly and just show you this whole concept of attachment scores. So this is a different project. This is aimed at finding prospects. That other one was aimed at managing a pool. Yeah, so we'll follow up. I'm being told that we actually do have a webinar on creating scores, and we were just looking at putting more up there. But to answer the question live, here's an example of how we handle it. So this is a page on ratings. So you got people, golf screen, and this could be Target, it could be whatever. Just assume somehow somebody put this together. There's a group that are bright red, 50 million or more. There's another group over here that are lower rated. And these attachment scores, there's a group that are called owners. So this is higher ed. These people would have been to a lot of reunions, been on a bunch of committees, given all the last 5 years, all the 5 years before that. We'll look at how it got calculated in a minute, but they're called owners. And over here, these people there's 27,000 of them roughly, are disconnected, like they graduated and haven't done a thing since. And you can see by the colors, the same colors in the two charts. There's some yellow and orange. There actually are some really high capacity people are disconnected and so forth. So let's look at the highly engaged owners. I'm going to select them here and go to this attachment score page. And what do we have? These guys run from a high score of 0.59. We were talking about scores a few minutes ago. There's a mathematical algorithm built off a predictive model that if we set one of these up, we build it off your data, then it embeds in this thing that loads your data every day. So this thing is dynamically updating daily, and it's what you can use for all the factor numbers and so forth. This guy's an owner. Why? He's been on 10 volunteer committees in the last 10 years. Usually your activities or committees table would know that. We can figure out from the gifts table he's given in all 5 of the last 5 years, gave in all 5 of the years before, been to 7 reunions, played 2 sports, and 2 student activities. If I flip this, the bottom of this list, 0.18 score, it's still highly engaged. But look at the difference. No volunteer committees. Most of the last year's 4 reunions, no sports. So if I go over here to the disconnected, let's grab the other end of this, you're going to see a very different, that's how the high end of the disconnected. 1 activity committee, no giving, 2 sports, 4. The bottom is probably all zeros. Yeah, all zeros. Haven't done a thing. No sports, no nothing. So the way we like to see this is use the data you have, because that's the most telling information for attachment or engagement. Are they coming to your events? Are they coming to your committees? Are they coming to your reunions? Are they clicking through on your newsletter, which is not in here? We encourage people to get that. And then the way we create the model, and you can use any statistical tool to do this, we love to do it, is grab everybody who's got capacity of, say, 100,000 or more, get capacity out of the way. They have capacity. Then select everybody who's made a gift of 100,000 or more, so they've given at or above their capacity, and let the model figure out what the weight are in these different factors. And you got to think through, like, what data do I have that's an indication of somebody's opt-in engagement or interest in my institution? We do the same thing with the patient side on the patient scores I talked about earlier, except it's in patient encounters data instead of this. And then the model will figure out the weights, and you can rank order them. And I can tell you these things range. We did this work at one school. Reunions were really well mature. We're way on the left, most important thing. We did another elite private school. Reunions were way on the right, but it's a much less mature program. So these are nuanced. And if you do this work, it needs to be done with your data and your alumni, your patient experience, because it's not the same. We had a healthcare institution. Usually if you live nearer, it's higher. We had one where there was like a hole around the location where the healthcare institution was, and it went up as soon as you got about 30 miles away. Like, what happened? Well, it turns out there was a bunch of local negative publicity that caused the local area to be negatively inclined versus people who were outside of that area and never got the messaging. And the data highlighted that, and we're like discussing it like, does this make any sense? And it totally did. So a little bit longer on these attachment, engagement, patient potential scores, but they're really valuable. And when we get them, I mean, we put them in a form like this. So if you want to, grab the high capacity, get rid of everybody else, highly engaged owners, to look at, here they are. There's 1527 of them. I might want to see, are they all staffed? I go to the next page. They're not all staffed. There's this group at the top, 269, who don't have a staff field officer. Grab them. Let's explore them. I can, like, where do they live? All over the country. My VP is going to the Bay Area. Let's grab the ones in the Bay Area. Go back to the first page. Here's 24 people who live somewhere in the Bay Area who aren't staffed, have high capacity, and are highly engaged. Let's go meet with them and screen them. I mean, maybe they should be in the pool. And so we're big on attachment factors being leveraged off your data in a way that they're dynamic. They're changing. People make gifts. They come to reunions. They get scored up. It ought to be not some like once a year thing. It ought to be an every day off the data because your data has it. And the last thing on that, there's a lot of talk about social media, which is great. It's hard to get it in bulk, and it usually, always is less influential than the things they're doing with your stuff, coming to events, coming to reunions, clicking through in your newsletter. And by the way, what they click through in your newsletter, they're telling you what they're interested in because they're clicking on, an article about neuroscience or whatever. So went a little long on that question, but it's an area of passion, as you probably figured out. Do you define capacity rating as the amount someone can give to all charities over a 5-year time frame? If not, how do you define it? Generally, that's what capacity rating is. It's the ability to give to all kinds of things. And what the attachment score does is give you an indication of how much they might give to you. If they really love you, they might give a lot of what they have to you. If they totally are disconnected from you, they're not going to give a lot to you. And if they're philanthropic, they might give it to a bunch of other stuff, but not likely to you. And the time frame. So sometimes, and some of the scores come with a liquidity factor. So the capacity could be expected in a year if somebody just sold their business and made $20 million. If they've got a private business that hasn't sold, it might be 20 years. So that 5 years, we actually use usually typically 7, is a median or an average. So if we don't have a liquidity score, we'll take the capacity, the $1 million, and divide by 5 or 7. We look at it a little bit, and that's per year how much you'd expect to get, and it gives you some sense of rough timing. And so there's a white paper we have on that. It's actually in the download from the Major Giving Metrics webinar on the website. It talks about all of this. You're better if you have liquidity, but many of the wealth screeners don't provide that, so we use 5 to 7 years as that factor. Here's another question. Do you think the number of each level of your funnel are different for organizations that do not have a built-in constituency, no alumni, grateful patients, etc.? Yeah, so the constituency matters. Let me go back over here, hold on. Yeah, the question was, does constituency matter as you look at these funnel numbers? And at this level, no. I mean, these funnel numbers are generally the same because you're talking about people. What does vary a lot, though, is the attachment or engagement factors. They're calculated very differently. The numbers I just showed were for alumni. If you took parents don't have those same experiences, so you can't use the same attachment model, and generally the scores are going to be ranked a lot lower. We are doing this work for a large state system school where they have like 12 cohorts. And the attachment for the business school is very different than the law school, which is very different with undergraduate and very different with graduate alumni because they have different experiences. So in our world, what we do in that case is we actually build 10 different attachment models, and then we give everybody one of those models. If there are 2 of them, we take the higher of the 2. But you cannot score attachment the same way for people who can't have the same experience. So that's going to impact, these giving levels, medians. It's going to impact a bunch of stuff, but it's not going to impact the basic logic here for comparable prospects. Let's see, one more question. If a fundraiser portfolio is too large, what criteria would look at to decide which prospects to drop? Yeah, so we would rank it by expected value, which is a combination of capacity and attachment. And you probably want to kind of look at both the numbers and see how firm you are. But we would literally rank order and then drop the bottom of the pool, because what you're going to have is they can't connect with everybody. So you can have that chart with a bunch of gray. You can have a bunch of gray, unpenetrated prospects. And what you want to make sure is you're not connecting with the higher expected value prospects, which may be harder to reach. So that model, if you give somebody too many, they may normally gravitate towards the lower level ones and leave the harder to reach upper level ones untapped, which is not the behavior you want. And we are at our 2 o'clock limit. I would, much more questions. We'll get these answered and emailed back to you if we didn't get them here. This webinar has been recorded in full, and we'll have it posted within the week and then push it out to you so you know that it's there. You can always get it off our webinar page if you never get our email, which we'll make sure you get. AdvisorSolutions.com uses webinars. There's a whole bunch of webinars up there. They're free. The attachments go with them, and this one will be up there within the week. So thank you very much for your time, and have a great rest of the afternoon.